Tonight, let's settle in and spend some time with the history of gay bathhouses. Welcome back to Queer History for Sleep. Tonight, we're going to spend some quiet time together exploring another corner of LGBTQ plus history. Before we begin, if you enjoy cozy bedtime stories and LGBTQ plus history, I'd really appreciate it if you'd like this video and subscribe. And if you enjoy tonight's story, I'll be back tomorrow night with the next episode in this series. Every episode on this channel is carefully researched, and you'll find the full source list for tonight's episode in the description below. Now get comfortable, and let's begin. Tonight's story is one of the oldest in queer history. It stretches back thousands of years, long before there was a word for what these spaces were, long before anyone had thought to give them a name at all. It is a story told in tile and steam and warm water. It is a story of men who needed somewhere to go, somewhere quiet and safe and away from the eyes of a world that did not want them to exist, and who found that place, again and again, across cultures and centuries, in the simple human act of bathing together. We are going to move through that story slowly tonight. There is no rush. The night is long and quiet, and this history deserves to be held gently, to be turned over and examined in the soft light of curiosity rather than urgency. So let your body settle wherever you are right now. Let the pillow find its shape against your head. Let the weight of the day begin to lift from your shoulders, from your chest, from the places where you carry things that are heavy. And let me take you back, very far back, to the beginning. Before we go anywhere, though, let us just rest here for a moment. There is no hurry. We have the whole night. Let your breathing go at whatever pace it wants to go. Let your shoulders release, just a little, if they've been holding something. Let your jaw soften. The history we're going to explore tonight is one of my favourites to sit with because it is so unexpectedly long. Most people, if they were asked to think about gay bathhouses, would think of the 1970s, of the era that produced the continental baths and the culture around it. Perhaps they'd think of the AIDS crisis and what happened in the 1980s. But tonight, we're going back much further than that. All the way back to the ancient world, to the first cities, to the first communal spaces that human beings built around water. And the thing about starting that far back is that it changes the scale of the story. It makes the story feel like what it is. One of the oldest continuously threading narratives in human experience. The impulse toward gathering, toward shared warmth, toward the particular social chemistry of bodies in close proximity, in a space set apart from the ordinary world. That impulse is ancient, and the attempts to suppress it, to police it, to drive it underground, those attempts are also ancient. The two have been in conversation with each other, pushing and pulling against each other for thousands of years. So let the scale of that settle in, quietly. We're going a long way tonight, and the night is long enough for it. Chapter 1. Ancient Waters. Communal bathing from antiquity to the Middle Ages. Let's begin at the very beginning of the story, or as close to the beginning as the historical record allows us to get. Around 4,500 years ago, in the cities of the Indus Valley civilization, something remarkable was being built. These were ancient cities, sophisticated and carefully planned, with streets laid out in precise grids and drainage systems so well engineered that they would not be equalled in Europe for another 2,000 years. The people who built these cities, understood water. They understood how to move it, how to contain it, how to use it as a resource for the communities they were creating. And among the structures they built, the granaries and the public halls and the elaborate drainage channels, archaeologists have found evidence of what may be among the earliest public bathhouses in human history. Structures designed not for a single family, not for private use alone, but for communities, for groups of people gathering together around water. The impulse to build a shared space for bathing, that impulse appears to be very nearly as old as civilization itself, long before written language had fully developed, long before the great empires and the great wars and the great philosophies that fill our history books. People were coming together around warm water and finding something in that act that was worth repeating, worth building permanent structures to support. We know they were built. We know they were used. We know they were, in some essential way, places where community happened. And we know that something about that impulse, the impulse toward communal bathing, toward shared warm water, toward the social space that a bath creates, has been with human beings ever since. In ancient Greece, the public bath was something closer to what we might today call a community centre. Men gathered there not only to wash, but to talk, to drink, to play games. The baths were woven into the fabric of daily social life. In ancient Greece, the bath was simply where you went when you wanted to be among people. Imagine the feeling of that. Arriving at a public bath in an ancient Greek city, not as an unusual thing, but simply as part of the ordinary rhythm of the day. The warmth of the water, the voices of other men, the games of knucklebones or dice, the smell of oil, the sound of water being poured from vessels, the splashing and the laughter and the arguments that fill any social space where people are relaxed and at ease. In ancient Greek culture, the body was not, as it would become in later Christian Europe, a source of shame or suspicion. The body was something to be exercised and admired and attended to. The gymnasium was also a space for philosophical conversation and social gathering. The wrestling ground and the philosophy school were, in a very real sense, part of the same cultural institution. And the bath was part of this same world. From Greece, let us move to Rome, and to a civilization that took the concept of the public bath and expanded it into something almost incomprehensibly grand. The Romans built bathhouses on a scale that still staggers the imagination. The greatest of these structures, the imperial thermae, were not simply places to bathe. They were entire worlds unto themselves. The baths of Trajan, completed in 109 CE, brought together swimming pools and libraries, exercise yards and club rooms, gardens and galleries. A man could arrive in the morning with nothing particular planned and spend an entire day there. The Roman thermae was, in a very real sense, the ancient world's version of everything at once. Think about the feeling of the interior of a place like that. The vast vaulted ceilings, the pools of water, some cool, some heated, the tepidarium and the coldarium, and the frigidarium, the steam rising from the heated water, the light filtering through high windows into spaces full of bodies and voices, and the quiet splashing of water. At Pompeii, the city buried by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 CE and preserved in extraordinary detail beneath centuries of volcanic ash, archaeologists, excavating a site called the Suburban Baths, found something remarkable. On the walls of the changing room, the locker room, the space where bathers undressed and stored their clothes, they found erotic frescoes painted directly onto the plaster, depicting scenes of intimate life in an explicit and specific way. Painted right there on the walls of the room that every bather passed through. Non-normative intimacy left its mark in these spaces, on the walls that everyone passed. They were not hidden. They were not whispered. They were right there on the wall of the locker room, visible to every person who came to the suburban baths of Pompeii. The connection between communal bathing and forms of intimacy that existed outside whatever the mainstream of a given culture approved of, that connection is not a modern invention. It is woven into the very origins of the bathhouse as a human institution. It is ancient. After the fall of Rome, the great imperial bathing complexes fell into disuse and disrepair. For several centuries, communal bathing in Western Europe declined sharply. But then, beginning in the 11th century, something shifted. European men began traveling east, knights and soldiers and pilgrims setting out on the Crusades. And in the cities of the Levant, they encountered a form of communal bathing that had never disappeared. They encountered the hammam. The Islamic hammam was a carefully designed sequence of spaces. You arrived and undressed in a cool outer room. Then you moved through progressively heated rooms. On the marble slabs of the main bathing room, you lay down, while an attendant worked at your body. Then cool water. Then the return to the outer room, to tea, or coffee, or conversation. In the cities of the Middle East and North Africa, the hammam was as essential a part of urban life as the marketplace or the mosque. The Crusaders brought this idea home with them, and these medieval European bathhouses quickly developed a reputation for activities that the church and the state did not entirely approve of. Medieval bathhouses in England came to be called stews, a word that began as a description of steam and became a synonym for brothel. In 1347, the Black Death reached Europe. Medieval physicians developed a theory that hot baths were dangerous, that the heat opened the pores of the skin, making the body vulnerable to the pestilential air they believed carried the disease. This theory was wrong, but people listened. What followed was a retreat from communal bathing that lasted approximately 400 years. But the fundamental human need for community, for warmth, for spaces apart from the surveillance of daily life, that need persisted. We see this most clearly in two events from the year 1492. In Florence, the city's criminal court, known as the Eight of Watch, issued formal decrees warning bathhouse managers to exclude suspect boys from their establishments. In the 2 years between 1492 and 1494, 44 men in Florence were convicted of consensual same-sex relations. And in the very same year, in the city of Granada, which had just fallen to the Catholic monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella, Queen Isabel ordered the systematic restriction of the public baths. The specific reason given in the historical record was to suppress homosexual reunions. These two moments from 1492 are windows into a world where the connection between communal bathing and same-sex desire was so well established that the authorities were making formal legal moves to sever it, which means, of course, that what they were targeting was real. The connection was real. The gatherings were real. The intimacy was real. And despite every decree and every conviction and every act of royal authority, it continued. It simply moved, adapted, found new forms, because the need was real, and the need did not disappear, simply because the authorities wished it would. Let us take a quiet breath here. Let the ancient world settle around you, the mosaic floors of Pompeii, the vast cool weight of the Roman thermae, the steam of a medieval stew, the hammams of Granada, the decrees of Florence, the sound of a city at night. These are the deep roots of our story. Now we are going to move forward. Chapter 2. The 4-stage journey. From municipal hygiene to sacred space, 1850s to 1960s. Let us settle now into the 19th century, into the cities of the industrial era. London, New York, Chicago, Manchester, Glasgow, Philadelphia, Boston. These are the cities of the world we recognize as modern, and they were being built in the decades after 1850 at extraordinary speed, with extraordinary energy. The great industrial cities of the 19th century were growing with a speed that outpaced every other aspect of urban infrastructure. Hundreds of thousands of people were moving to these cities from the countryside, drawn by the work that the factories and docks and warehouses offered, and they were being housed in neighborhoods of tenements and row houses and crowded apartments that had been thrown up quickly and cheaply, without the infrastructure for comfortable daily life. These neighborhoods did not have running water in their individual homes. Working-class families did not have bathtubs. They did not have showers. Hot water in the average working-class home of 1870 or 1880 was something you heated yourself in a pot, on a stove, in limited quantities, at considerable effort. And so, to meet this practical and public health need, cities began to build public bathhouses, municipal hygiene facilities, simple, functional, affordable places where working-class people could come and pay a small fee to have access to hot water and a clean space in which to wash themselves. These were not luxurious places. They were not designed for leisure. They were built for the prosaic purpose of allowing the urban working class to maintain basic cleanliness. But something else happened in these spaces. Men who came to these municipal bathhouses were, by the very nature of the space, in the company of other men. They were undressed, or partially undressed. They were relaxed, unguarded, removed from the social roles and performances and distances that governed their daily lives outside. And in that context, occasionally, quietly, discreetly, connections formed. This is the first stage of the 4-stage evolution. Ordinary bathhouses. Late 19th century municipal hygiene facilities, where same-sex encounters were occasional and highly discreet. The men who found each other in those ordinary municipal bathhouses were not, for the most part, men who had the language or the community structures that later generations of gay men would develop. They had, in many cases, no word for what they were. The word homosexual itself was only coined in 1869, and it remained a clinical and largely academic term for decades afterward. What they had was each other, and the knowledge, fragile, partial, passed carefully from one person to another in whispers or hints or glances, of which spaces were safer than others. This knowledge travelled through a kind of clandestine network, an informal information system built of word of mouth and careful observation. This network was entirely clandestine. It had no official form. It left no records that were designed to survive. It existed in the spaces between official life, in the whispered conversations of men who could not speak openly about what they knew or what they wanted. And yet, it functioned. The research for tonight's episode specifically mentions MCAs, Young Men's Christian Associations, as examples of the kinds of venues that developed subcultural reputations in this way. The YMCA was an explicitly Christian organisation founded in London in 1844, whose goal was the spiritual improvement and healthy development of young men in the industrial city. But the same features that made the YMCA useful for its stated mission, the dormitories, the gyms, the pools, also made certain YMCA facilities into places where connections formed that were not part of the original vision. This is the second stage. Specific venues developing subcultural reputations through clandestine word-of-mouth networks. The third stage happened in the 1920s and 1930s. These early gay bathhouses were physically traditional. They looked like bathhouses. But within those familiar structures, something had changed. There were lockable private cubicles. This architectural detail might seem small when stated baldly, but in the context of a world where same-sex intimacy was a crime, where men were regularly arrested on the streets and in parks, in that context, a room with a lock on the door was something close to a miracle. It was the difference between exposure and safety. It was, quite literally, the difference between freedom and a prison cell. The fourth and final stage came in the 1950s and 1960s. By this time, the spaces in question were exclusively commercial facilities, places that existed specifically to serve the community that had been quietly finding its way to bathhouses for decades. The research document describes these venues as functioning as oases of camaraderie, not just sanctuary, not just safety, but camaraderie, the fellowship of men who understood each other's situation, the warmth of being among people who were like you, in a world that insisted you were alone. The post-war years in America, the 1950s especially, were, for gay men, years of extraordinary pressure. Being known or suspected of homosexuality could cost a man his job, his family, his freedom, his reputation, his entire carefully constructed life. The performance of normalcy was for many gay men the dominant feature of their daily existence. It was exhausting in a way that is difficult to fully convey. The oases of camaraderie offered relief from that labour. A few hours in which the performance was not required, in which you could be in a room with other men who also knew, and for whom the simple act of being seen, truly seen without the mask, was not dangerous. Now let us look at some of the specific bathhouses that embodied these stages of evolution. The Everard Baths in New York City had originally been constructed in 1860 as the Free Will Baptist Church. The building was converted, reportedly at a cost of $150,000, into a bathhouse featuring a basement pool and private rooms on the third floor. Truman Capote came to the Everard Baths. Gore Vidal came to the Everard Baths. Rudolf Nureyev came to the Everard Baths. These are not marginal figures. These are men whose work is still celebrated, whose names are still recognized, whose contributions to American and world culture are permanent. And they all found their way to a converted Baptist church in Manhattan that had a pool in the basement. The Lafayette Baths operated in a commercial Russian-Turkish style. It had lockable private rooms, there to protect against street extortionists who preyed specifically on gay men, threatening to expose their secrets unless money was paid. Among its patrons was Charles Griffes, an American composer of classical music, and the Gershwin brothers, George and Ira, appear in connection with the Lafayette Baths as managers. George, who composed Rhapsody in Blue. Ira, who wrote the lyrics to Some to Watch Over Me and I Got Rhythm. These men had a connection to the Lafayette Baths. In London, the Savoy Turkish Baths operated in the Victorian and Edwardian style, what the research document describes as a twilight arena. Hot rooms, tiled steam chambers, massage tables. Rock Hudson came to the Savoy Turkish Baths. The man who was, in the 1950s, perhaps the most successfully marketed masculine ideal in Hollywood history. Rock Hudson, in the private hours that those public appearances did not account for, made his way to the Savoy Turkish Baths in London, and the Bermondsey Baths in London, Victorian-style municipal public baths, the most utilitarian of establishments, appear in the diaries of Kenneth Williams, the English actor and comedian best known for the Carry On films. Williams described them as quite fabulous for what he called a total lack of sexual restraint. These 4 specific bathhouses are a handful of particular places within a much larger landscape of similar spaces that existed in cities across the English-speaking world and beyond. Each of them is an instance of the same essential phenomenon, the slow, quiet, determined building of spaces where men could be themselves. Chapter 3. Shadows and Smoke, the Underworld Era, Mid-Century Secrecy. Let us settle now into the middle of the 20th century, into the 1940s and 1950s, into a period when the shadows around gay life were at their deepest, and when the silences were most complete. Gay men in mid-century America and Britain were living under conditions that are worth trying to understand in their full weight tonight. Homosexuality was a crime, not metaphorically, a crime, legally. On the books, state sodomy laws criminalized same-sex intimacy between men. The consequences of being discovered, arrested, prosecuted were specific, concrete, and devastating. Men lost their jobs. Men lost their families. Men were imprisoned. Men appeared in newspapers under their real names. And yet, the desire persisted. The need for community persisted. The need for spaces where the performance of false normalcy was not required. That need did not disappear, simply because the law said that acting on it was criminal. Because homosexual intimacy was strictly criminalized, gay bathhouses could not operate as legitimate businesses. They could not exist openly. They could not advertise. They could not rely on the ordinary protections of law. Into this vulnerability stepped organized crime. The mafia saw in the gay bars and gay bathhouses, quietly operating throughout the country, a business opportunity. They moved into these spaces, sometimes operating them directly, sometimes providing protection in the cynical sense that word carried in the world of organized crime. Protection meant the payment of bribes to police precincts and individual officers to ensure that establishments would not be raided. But the protection came at a price far beyond the percentage of the door. Because the organized crime operators who controlled these spaces also engaged in blackmail. Systematic, deliberate, organized blackmail. Underworld operators routinely photographed prominent or closeted patrons inside the baths, threatening to reveal their secrets to employers or families unless money was paid. The research document calls this mid-century landscape the predatory margin. The men who occupied it were being preyed upon by the very forces that were, paradoxically, the only things keeping them from a police raid. This is the specific and terrible double bind that criminalization creates. when you cannot operate in the light, when you cannot call the police if you are threatened, when you have no legal recourse and no public voice, you become dependent on whatever shadow structures exist. And those shadow structures will exploit your vulnerability. And yet, men came to these spaces. They kept coming. Because what was offered there, even with all its attendant dangers, was something that could not be found anywhere else in the world. The bathhouse in this era functioned as what the research document calls a rejection-free sanctuary. In the daily world of a gay man in 1950s, America, rejection was the baseline condition of existence. It was the weather that never changed, the rejection of family, often, the rejection of community, the rejection of law and of state authority, the rejection of a social order that had decided, at every level, that your desire was criminal and your love was shameful. Imagine waking up every morning knowing that something fundamental about who you are is, in the eyes of the law and the church, and virtually every social institution you interact with, a crime. Knowing that if the wrong person at the wrong moment were to see you clearly, your entire life as you have constructed it could be destroyed. Your job, gone. Your family relationships, severed. Your name, in the newspaper, under a headline that would follow you for the rest of your life. Now imagine managing that knowledge, quietly, constantly, every single day. The careful editing of speech, the monitoring of expressions, the calibration of every interaction with the world to ensure that nothing slips. And then they walked through the door of the bathhouse. And something shifted. What made that shift possible was facilitated, in part, by something as simple as a piece of cloth. The white towel. The white towel was democratic. When a man walked in from the street and exchanged his clothing for a simple white towel, he left behind the things that his clothing carried. His suit, or his work clothes, signaled class, profession, social status, economic position. The towel stripped all of that away. A man in a white towel was just a man in a white towel. What remained was just the body, in the warmth and the steam. Rudolf Nureyev and a shop assistant, Truman Capote and a postal worker, a senator and a taxi driver. In the white towel, in the steam, they were all just men who had come to the same place, for the same reason. The connections formed in these spaces, the friendships and the romances, and the simple, wordless camaraderie of men who understood each other's situation without having to speak it aloud. These connections were real, and they were, perhaps, intensified by the very conditions of danger in which they formed. This is the bathhouse of the mid-20th century, held in the grip of organized crime, operating under constant threat of exposure and ruin, visited by famous men and ordinary men alike, wrapped in the democratic white towel, offering something that could not be found in the daylight world, a rejection-free sanctuary, a temporary reprieve from the weight of being different, in a world that punished difference without mercy. And then came the late 1960s, and the world changed. Chapter 4. Golden Light. The Post-Stonewall. Boom. 1968 to 1980. On the warm late June night of 1969, in Greenwich Village in New York City, the police raided the Stonewall Inn. What followed? The resistance that broke out among the bar's patrons, the nights of protest in the street outside, the moment that gay liberation as an organized political and cultural force became real in America. That story belongs to another episode of this series, but its effects on the bathhouse world were profound and nearly immediate. Post-Stonewall, something in the air changed. Gay liberation as a movement emerged with a new visibility and a new assertiveness, a determination to exist, not in the shadows, but in some portion of the light. And the bathhouse underwent its own transformation in the years after Stonewall. A transformation that the research document describes with a word that would have seemed impossible in the context of the mafia-controlled spaces of the 1950s. The word is opulent. Post-Stonewall, the bathhouse became, in its most elaborate and celebrated manifestations, an opulent monument to liberation and high culture. The spaces we had been describing were defined by concealment. And now, in the aftermath of Stonewall, some men were building bathhouses that were not defined by concealment, that were, instead, spectacular. There is no better example of this transformation than the Continental Baths. Steve Ostrow had a background in entertainment. He had worked in theatre and music. And that background shaped his vision for what the Continental Baths could be. He wanted it to be more than a bathhouse. He wanted it to be a destination. Ostrow opened the Continental Baths in 1968, in the basement and lower floors of the Ansonia Hotel, on Broadway, on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. The Ansonia was not an ordinary building. It had been built in 1904 as a luxury residential hotel in the Beaux-Arts style. Enormous, stretching an entire city block, its facade covered in terracotta ornament and curving bays and towers with French-style rooflines. It had been home to an extraordinary procession of residents, opera singers, athletes, theatre people, artists, and musicians. Into the basement of this grand building, Ostrow brought his vision. Working with an architect named Richard Orbach, he created what the research document describes as a Roman-themed playground. Orbach built waterfalls inside the building. Actual waterfalls, engineered into the interior of the Ansonia. He built a cruising labyrinth in black marble. There was a room that the research document identifies as the orgy room, featuring carpeted risers built in the manner of an amphitheatre, seating arranged in tiers, in the way the ancient world arranged its gathering spaces for the observation of collective experience. Think about what it means to design a space like that, to take the kinds of gathering and intimacy that had previously been pushed into the most marginal and hidden of spaces, and to build an architecture around them. To say, in stone and carpet and the sound of water, this is a space built for this. This is a space that acknowledges, deliberately and without apology, what happens here. But the Continental Baths was not only a physical space. It became, in the years after Stonewall, something that no bathhouse had ever been. A cultural venue. A place where art happened. Steve Ostrow introduced live performances at the Continental, cabaret evenings at which performers came to entertain the patrons. And these evenings became remarkable for something that would have been, just a few years earlier, almost unimaginable. Straight celebrities came to them. Alfred Hitchcock came to the Continental Baths. Mick Jagger came to the Continental Baths. The image of Alfred Hitchcock and Mick Jagger, poolside at a gay bathhouse in the basement of the Ansonia Hotel, is one of those images that doesn't quite fit into any of the usual categories we use for thinking about cultural history. It's too strange and too specific and too perfectly illustrative of something that was happening in this brief extraordinary moment, a crossing over. And the entertainment that drew them, the performances that made the Continental famous, far beyond the gay community it served, came in the form of a young woman who was, at that point, almost entirely unknown. Her name was Bette Midler. Bette Midler had come to New York to pursue a performing career. Someone brought her to the Continental Baths. She performed. And what happened in those performances, in front of that specific audience, in that specific space, is one of the more remarkable creative developments in the history of American entertainment. The gay men of the Continental Baths became the crucible in which Bette Midler found her voice. It was there, performing in the basement of the Ansonia Hotel for men in white towels, that she developed the larger-than-life, raucous, irreverent, deeply funny, and surprisingly tender performance style that would make her one of the most beloved entertainers in American history. She called herself the Divine Miss M, and she became the Divine Miss M, developed that persona, tested it, and refined it, and made it real. In front of that audience, in that room. Her accompanist at the Continental Baths was a young pianist named Barry Manilow. Barry Manilow, who would go on to one of the most commercially successful recording careers of the 1970s. He sat at a baby grand piano in the basement of the Ansonia Hotel and played for Bette Midler and for the men of the Continental Baths. While the Continental Baths was creating its Roman-themed fantasia, other men were thinking about the bathhouse world in different ways. John Jack W. Campbell had an idea that had not existed in the gay bathhouse world before. Not a single magnificent venue. A chain. A franchise. A network of locations operating under the same name and the same model. His business was called Club Baths, and it eventually expanded to 42 locations across the United States. Campbell used the profits from Club Baths to fund gay civil rights advocacy. Specifically, according to the research document, he financed a national campaign against Anita Bryant, who in 1977 led a campaign called Save Our Children that successfully repealed a gay civil rights ordinance in Dade County, Florida. The vice that the authorities had been trying to shut down for centuries was the engine of the movement's finances. Bruce Mailman opened the new St. Mark's Baths in New York City, and the design philosophy behind it was captured in a phrase that the research document preserves: minimizing shame. Mailman wanted to create a space that worked against the accumulated weight of shame that gay men carried. He installed at the admissions desk a piece of furniture made of brass, designed in a bank vault style. This specific choice of materials and aesthetic vocabulary is doing something quite precise. A bank vault style brass admissions desk is the language of institutions, of permanence, of establishments that are confident in their legitimacy. Mailman was saying, in the material language of his admissions desk, this is a real place. This is a legitimate place. You are welcome to come here, and you do not need to be ashamed of coming here. The effect was real. At the new St. Mark's Baths, men felt safe signing in with their legal names. The facility featured 162 private cubicles, each with warm lighting. The profits from those rooms were later used by Mailman to fund the construction of a nightclub called The Saint, which would become one of the most legendary venues in New York gay life. The dozen years or so between 1968 and 1980, what the research document calls the golden era of the gay bathhouse, were remarkable not just for the physical spaces that were created, but for what those spaces represented. Gay men claiming beauty, claiming luxury, claiming the right to culture, claiming the right to design a space that minimized shame rather than enforced it, claiming the right to build institutions that could fund political movements. They were extraordinary years, but the very visibility that made them extraordinary was also, simultaneously, attracting attention of a kind that the community could not afford, the attention of the state. Chapter 5. The Raids. Policing Desire. A chronicle of vice and resistance. Throughout the story we've been telling tonight, one thread has run alongside the history of the bathhouse itself, the history of the people who wanted to close it. The earliest entry in the research document's record of raids takes us back to 1876, to Paris, France. A bathhouse called the Bain de Gymnase was raided. The manager was prosecuted for facilitating pederasty. Not the patrons primarily, but the operator. The strategy of prosecuting the operators, rather than simply arresting the patrons, is worth noting, because it would reappear throughout the next century and more. In 1903, in New York City, the first recorded municipal vice raid in the United States targeted the Ariston Hotel baths. 60 men were detained, 14 were arrested. 60 men in a single bathhouse on a single night. In 1969, the year of Stonewall, the Continental Baths was raided by an undercover police officer who had entered wearing a white towel, like any other patron, and then arrested 22 patrons for soliciting sex. The white towel that the research document described as democratic, the great equalizer, had become a tool of infiltration. The 1969 raid prompted early organized political protests against entrapment tactics. In 1976, a raid on the Ottawa Club Baths in Canada arrested 27 men and seized membership lists containing 3,000 names. 3,000 men who had given their personal information to an establishment they trusted now had their names in police files. The raid was believed to be a pre-Olympic cleanup ahead of the Montreal Games. It catalyzed major protests. In 1979, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, a police chief named Harold Breyer directed homophobic raids on multiple spas. The forced closures led to the founding of the Cream City Business Association, an organization to support and advocate for gay-owned businesses. The raids intended to suppress gay community life had produced, paradoxically, a new institution dedicated to that community's protection. And then there is Toronto, 1981, Operation Soap, February 5th, 1981. The Toronto police launched a coordinated raid on 4 bathhouses simultaneously. In a single night, more than 300 men were arrested. This was a planned, large-scale police operation designed to send a message. We know where you are, and we are willing to come for you in force. The message the gay community received was not the one the police intended. Within 48 hours, thousands of people were in the streets. The protests that followed were among the largest Toronto had ever seen on a gay rights issue. Operation Soap has come to be known as the Canadian Stonewall, the event that galvanized the modern Canadian LGBTQ+ rights movement. And yet the 300+ people arrested were real people with real lives. Their names appeared in newspapers. Some lost jobs. Some were outed to families who had not known. Some carried the consequences of that night for years. The raids were catalysts for political change. They were also individual tragedies. Both things are true simultaneously. The men who went to these establishments were not doing anything that caused harm to anyone. They were simply being together in the way that they needed to be together. The criminality was the law's, not theirs. These spaces were fought over, contested, raided, closed, mourned. They were never simply places. They were always arguments, made in tile and steam, about the right of gay men to exist. And just as the community was building something that looked, for the first time, like real political power, something else arrived. Something none of them were prepared for. Chapter 6: Fire and Renewal. The AIDS crisis, the closure battles, and the world that followed. Let us slow down here as we enter this part of tonight's story. Let the quiet of the night settle around you a little more completely, because this chapter asks us to hold something very heavy, to sit with a loss that was, in its scale and its specificity, almost beyond comprehension. The HIV and AIDS epidemic. It arrived quietly at first, a cluster of unusual illnesses appearing in young men in Los Angeles and New York, beginning in 1981. Cases of a rare pneumonia occurring in young men who should have been healthy, a rare skin cancer, Kaposi's sarcoma, appearing in unusual numbers in young men in New York. The disease did not yet have a name. It would be several years before the virus causing it was identified, several more before reliable tests were available, and still more years before effective treatments. By the early 1980s, the epidemic was devastating the communities that had built the spaces we've been talking about tonight. Men were dying. Friends, lovers, neighbors, the people you passed in the corridors of the baths. They were becoming ill, and they were dying, in large numbers. The golden era was over. Not in a single moment, not immediately, but inexorably and completely, as the scale of the epidemic became clear, and the nature of the loss became real. And within the community experiencing this catastrophe, a debate broke out. A painful, necessary, agonizing debate about what to do, about whether the bathhouses should continue to exist. On one side of this debate stood, among others, a playwright named Larry Kramer. Kramer was already one of the most insistent voices in the AIDS crisis, a man who was documenting the deaths of his friends and his community with ferocious urgency. He would go on to found the advocacy organization ACTE Up. Kramer argued that the bathhouses needed to be closed. His argument was essentially this: the bathhouses were environments specifically designed for multi-partner sexual activity. In the context of an epidemic spreading through sexual contact, these environments were structurally incompatible with the community's survival. This argument was not wrong about the facts of transmission. It came from real knowledge of what was happening, from watching real people die, and from a desperate, grief-driven desire to do something that might slow the dying. On the other side stood advocates who argued that closing the bathhouses would be not just ineffective, but actively harmful. If the bathhouses were closed, men would not simply stop seeking sexual contact. They would seek it elsewhere, in parks, in private homes, in other places that had none of the features a bathhouse could in principle provide. Education materials about the epidemic, condoms, the presence of a community, grappling with the risk together. Closing the bathhouses would not reduce the behavior. It would simply remove it from an environment where some harm reduction was possible. The anti-closure advocates also argued that the closures would be an unequal application of the law. Heterosexual venues where high-risk behavior also occurred were not being targeted by the same health authorities. And more fundamentally, The bathhouses were civil rights sanctuaries. They were the spaces that gay men had fought for, over decades, against state power that had tried to eliminate them. Closing them was not just a public health measure. It was an attack on the institutional life of the community at the moment when that community was most vulnerable. Both arguments had genuine weight. Both were made by people watching the same catastrophe unfold. It was a genuine disagreement about strategy, about what would actually save the most lives. In San Francisco, in 1984, the debate reached its most urgent and most public form. The city's health director, Mervyn Silverman, initially resisted the calls for closure, believing that closing the baths would drive behavior underground, making education and prevention harder. But political pressure was intense. Mayor Dianne Feinstein pushed for action. Undercover observers were sent into the bathhouses to document what was happening. They produced an 85-page report. A judge named William Mullins issued an injunction that effectively banned private rooms with locking doors in these establishments. The lockable private room, the crucial innovation of the 1920s and 30s, the thing that had provided protection from arrest, was banned by legal order. In New York City, 1985, the city moved to update its sanitary code to authorize the closure of bathhouses determined to pose a public health risk. The first target was the new St. Mark's Baths, Bruce Mailman's establishment, the place with the bank vault brass admissions desk, the place designed to minimize shame, the place with 162 private cubicles and warm lighting, the place where men had felt safe enough to give their real names. When health officials arrived to padlock the new St. Mark's Baths, they discovered something that has stayed in the historical record as one of the most quietly remarkable details in the entire story we've been telling tonight. The building did not have a lock on the front door. The new St. Mark's Baths had been open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, since 1979. 6 years of continuous operation, never closing, always open at every hour to any man who came through the door. And in those 6 years, no lock had ever been placed on the front door, because a lock would have been a statement of closure, of limitation, of the hours at which you were not welcome. A statement that Bruce Mailman's establishment had never wanted to make. Now health officials arrived to padlock it, and they had to bring their own lock. Bruce Mailman challenged the closure in court. The case became known as City of New York versus New St. Mark's Baths. He argued that the closure was an unconstitutional overreach, an improper use of public health authority, a selective application of the law against a community that had long been targeted by the state. He argued all of this, and he lost. The closure stood. Bruce Mailman died of AIDS-related complications in 1994. He was a man who had looked at the world that gay men were living in, and had decided to try to make a specific part of that world better. He had thought carefully about shame, about where it came from, what it did to people, how architecture and design could either reinforce it or quietly work against it. He had made a design philosophy out of the idea of minimizing shame, and he had put that philosophy into a specific physical space, and the city came to padlock his establishment, and he fought it, and he lost. And then he died, in 1994, of the same epidemic that had been the reason given for the closure in the first place. He did not live to see the legal and cultural changes that would eventually come. He lived through the building and the loss, and died before the rebuilding. The closures of the mid-1980s did not end the epidemic. The virus did not respect padlocks or injunctions. The epidemic continued to rage through the late 1980s and into the 1990s, killing hundreds of thousands of people and remaking the world for those who survived. What is clear is that the world on the other side of the epidemic's most devastating years was a different world. The community had been changed in fundamental ways, by grief, by loss, by the organizing that the crisis had forced, by the political changes that organizing had eventually produced. And the bathhouse, as an institution, had been changed too. Changed, but not eliminated. The spaces that survived the AIDS crisis did so by adapting, by incorporating the public health work that the epidemic had made urgently necessary, by becoming sites of safer sex education and outreach, as well as sites of community gathering. Interlude. The in-between years. Let us rest here for a moment, in the space between the crisis and what came after. Because the years between the closure orders of the mid-1980s and the digital revolution of the early 2000s deserve more than a quick transit. They were years of rebuilding. Yes. But before the rebuilding, there was the sitting in the rubble, the looking around at what had been lost and trying to understand the scale of it. The people who died in the AIDS epidemic were not statistics. They were the men who had sat on the carpeted risers of the continental baths and listened to Bette Midler. They were the men who had signed their names at the brass admissions desk of the new St. Mark's. They were the men who had found each other through the clandestine word-of-mouth networks of an earlier era, who had built the businesses and the political organizations and the cultural institutions that made the community of the 1970s what it was. There is a particular quality to the grief of an epidemic, different from other kinds of grief. It does not come once and then stop. It comes repeatedly, without pattern or predictability, as the people you know and love become ill and then die. It accumulates, and it is social grief as well as personal grief. The grief of watching a community be hollowed out, of seeing the spaces and the institutions and the gathering places of your world go quiet or close entirely. The bathhouses that remained open in this period did so by adapting, by doing things they had not previously done, distributing condoms, putting up educational materials, sometimes partnering with community health organizations to make testing available. The spaces transformed from places primarily oriented toward intimacy and community into places that also, sometimes uncomfortably, sometimes with great difficulty, held the public health work that the epidemic required. But through all of this, the essential function persisted. Men came. They came because they needed to be somewhere, because the need for community and warmth and the particular kind of knowing that happens in these spaces did not diminish simply because the world around it was in crisis. If anything, in the years of the epidemic, when isolation and fear and grief were constant features of gay life, the need for those spaces was more acute, not less. The establishments that remained open in this period, smaller, more modest, operating more carefully, became, in many ways, more explicitly about community than they had ever been before. Men who came to the surviving bathhouses in the late 1980s and early 1990s were coming to spaces that knew they were important, that understood themselves as custodians of something that needed to be maintained. In these years, the physical spaces of the bathhouse became, in many cities, among the most important sites of AIDS education and outreach in the gay community, not in spite of what they were, but because of it, because the men who most needed to receive information about the epidemic, those men were there, in the bathhouses. And in the background, science was slowly progressing, treatments were improving, the virus was being understood. By the mid-1990s, the arrival of combination antiretroviral therapy changed the picture dramatically, turning HIV from a rapidly fatal disease into a chronic manageable condition for many of those with access to treatment. The community was still grieving. The losses were still enormous. But there was, for the first time in years, a sense that a future was possible. Chapter 7. The Modern Frontier. Digital Fatigue and the Return to Steam. In 2009, a company launched a mobile application called Grindr. Grindr was designed specifically for gay and bisexual men. A location-based app that showed you, in real time, the other men using it who were physically closest to you. You could see their profiles, their photographs, their distances in feet or meters. You could send messages. You could arrange to meet. All of this without leaving your apartment, without going to a bar or a bathhouse or any particular place at all. This was, in a very real sense, a technological solution to the problem that the clandestine word-of-mouth networks of the 19th century had been laboriously trying to solve. How do you find other men like yourself in a city full of strangers? For 100 years, the answer had involved physical gathering places, subcultural reputations, careful observation, whispered information. Grindr eliminated most of those requirements. The research document describes what Grindr created as a hybrid space, a space that existed not in a specific physical location, but in the gap between the digital and the physical. With Grindr, a man could be in an entirely ordinary environment, and through the app, that ordinary space became, temporarily and invisibly, a queer space. A space where connection with other gay men was possible. For gay men living in cities and towns where there were no bathhouses, no gay bars, no visible queer community infrastructure of any kind, Grindr represented access to something they had never had before. But something else happened alongside the convenience, something the research document calls digital fatigue. Digital fatigue, a persistent sense of regret and alienation, the constant connectivity of apps like Grindr, the always available scroll of profiles and potential encounters, the ease of digital contact that seemed to promise unlimited access to human connection. This produced in many of the men who used it not satisfaction, but a kind of hollowness, a sense that something had been subtracted. The thing that had been subtracted was presence, the quality of actually being somewhere, of being in a physical space with other people, of breathing the same air, of the particular warmth and aliveness of actual human proximity. The scroll of profiles was not the same thing as the experience of moving through the corridors of a bathhouse, of being in a room with other men who were there for the same reason. The digital mediation of encounter had paradoxically made some aspects of encounter feel less real. The specific quality of the rejection-free sanctuary, which was a physical quality, a quality of actually being in a space that felt different from the outside world, could not be replicated by an app. It required a room. It required tiles and steam and the sound of other people present. There was also a more practical dimension. High urban rents in the cities, where gay populations have historically concentrated, have made it increasingly difficult for many gay men to maintain the kind of private domestic space that would allow for hosting, the practice of inviting another person to one's home. The combination of digital fatigue and practical constraints has catalyzed what the research document calls a renaissance for physical saunas, a renewed interest in, and a renewed appreciation for, the physical gathering space. Men who had spent years navigating the landscape of hookup apps found themselves rediscovering the particular value of a place where you could actually be. The bathhouse was back. Or more accurately, it had never entirely left, and the conditions of contemporary life had reminded people of why it mattered. And there was something appropriate about the fact that the institution was still there, waiting for them, still operating, still heated, still offering the white towel, still providing the democratic anonymity and the warmth and the particular social chemistry of bodies in close proximity, in a space set apart from the ordinary world. The contemporary sauna has undergone a transformation in how it presents itself to the world. It has shed what the research document calls the historical vice stigma. The explicit, transgressive, shadow world associations that had defined the bathhouse through so much of its history have given way to something different. The contemporary sauna does not position itself as an underground space. It positions itself as a health and wellness resource. This repositioning has been achieved through active partnerships with public health departments and community health organizations, rather than existing in an adversarial relationship with the institutions of public health, as the bathhouses of the mid-century had, necessarily. The contemporary sauna has found a way to make itself useful to those institutions. The most striking example of this new role came during the 2022 outbreak of Mpox, a viral disease that disproportionately affected gay and bisexual men. During that outbreak, venues like Steamworks Toronto became frontline vaccination clinics. Health departments partnered with these establishments. Nurses and health educators arrived on site. Men who came to the sauna could receive their Mpox vaccination in the same visit. The establishment that had been raided and padlocked and prosecuted, whose predecessors had been pursued by vice squads for more than a century. It was now a healthcare delivery point for the public health system. The distance between Operation Soap in 1981 and the vaccination clinic at Steamworks Toronto in 2022 is not simply a matter of 41 years. It is a distance measured in the enormous, hard-won, imperfectly achieved progress of the intervening decades. The specific health tools that the contemporary sauna now makes available include pre-exposure prophylaxis, known as PrEP, a medication taken daily that is over 99% effective at blocking HIV infection when taken consistently. Doxy-PEP, doxycycline taken within 72 hours after sexual contact, shown to reduce rates of chlamydia by 80% and syphilis by 76%, the Mpox vaccine, and PEEP, post-exposure prophylaxis for HIV, a 28-day course of medication that, when started within 72 hours of a potential HIV exposure, is highly effective at preventing permanent infection. These are the interventions being made available within or through the contemporary gay sauna. Through the successor institutions of the spaces that were raided in Paris in 1876 and New York in 1903, that were controlled by the mob in the 1950s, that achieved golden opulence in the 1970s, and were padlocked in the 1980s and rebuilt in the years after. Through those spaces, today, men can receive vaccinations and medications and health education that may save their lives. The clinically integrated wellness hub is the great-grandchild of the municipal hygiene bathhouse of the 19th century. It has travelled an extraordinary distance. Epilogue. A living monument. The gay bathhouse serves as a living monument to queer resilience and a laboratory for gay political identity. A living monument, not a dead memorial, not a historical artifact housed under glass, but something alive, something still breathing, still operating, still serving the purpose it has served, in various forms, and under various threats, and through various reinventions, for very nearly as long as human civilization has existed in recognizable form. A laboratory for gay political identity, a place where the political and cultural and personal work of being gay in the world has been tested and developed and refined, where the community has figured out how to survive, how to organize, how to resist, how to rebuild. Both of those characterizations are exactly right. The bathhouse is a living monument because it has survived. It has survived the plague of the 14th century and the morality campaigns of the 15th. It has survived the decrees of the Eight of Watch in Florence and the orders of Queen Isabel in Granada. It has survived the mafia and the blackmail photographers and the vice squads and Operation Soap. It has survived the AIDS epidemic and the closure orders and the padlocks on the doors. It has survived digital disruption and the invasion of the smartphone. It is still here. Changed, evolved, reconfigured. Now, a clinically integrated wellness hub rather than a clandestine oasis of camaraderie. But here. Serving the same essential function it has always served, providing gay men with a physical space in which to gather, in which to be together, in which to exist, as themselves. The research document preserves, in its concluding section, a phrase that I want to leave with you as we end tonight's story. It says that long before there were parades or protective laws, there were these wet, anonymous margins where gay men asserted their right to exist. Wet, anonymous margins. Wet, because these were bathhouses, spaces of water and steam, and the particular warm dampness that fills a tiled room where hot water runs, and bodies are present. Anonymous, because for so much of their history, the men who gathered in them could not be known, could not use their real names, could not be visible, could not acknowledge in any official public way what they were and what they sought. Margins, because these spaces existed at the edges, not at the centre of official life, not in the places of power and recognition, but in the basements and the converted churches and the municipal hygiene facilities and the Victorian steam chambers. And yet within those wet, anonymous margins, something was being built. Not just buildings, though buildings were being built. Not just institutions, though institutions were being built. Something more fundamental. The knowledge of a community. The understanding that you were not alone. The felt sense, hard to articulate, but impossible to mistake when you had it, that somewhere, in the steam and the warmth and the democratic white towel, there were other people who understood you, who knew what it meant to carry what you carried, who had come to the same place for the same reason, and who, without any official language or institutional framework, recognized each other. That recognition. That is what the bathhouse was for. That, underneath all the history, and the architecture, and the politics, and the raids, and the epidemics, and the resistance, and the survival, and the reinvention, that is what it has always been for. A place to be known, even in anonymity. A place to belong, even in the margins. A place to exist, even when the world outside insisted you did not. Long before the parades, long before the protective laws, long before any of the public, visible, celebrated markers of gay life that we now take for granted were possible, there were the baths. And the baths are still here. Let the night be very quiet now, as we close. You've been with me for a long time tonight. We've travelled a great distance, from the cities of the Indus Valley to the ruins of Pompeii, from the hammams of medieval Europe to the converted Baptist church in Manhattan, from the Saturday cabarets of the Continental Baths to the padlocked door of the new St. Mark's, from the streets of Toronto, on a February night in 1981, to the vaccination clinic at Steamworks in 2022. Thank you for spending this evening with me in the history of gay bathhouses. Now, let the story settle. Let the warmth of it. And it is a warm story, despite everything. Despite the raids and the losses and the padlocks, it is fundamentally a warm story, a story about people finding each other and holding on. Let that warmth come with you into sleep. Let your body find its rest in the place where you are. Let your mind grow quiet, and let the night do its work. The history is still there, woven into the fabric of things. The tile, and the steam, the towels, and the corridors, the waterfalls, and the locked doors, and the brass admissions desk, and the front door that never needed a lock because it was always open. They're not going anywhere, and neither are you. Sleep well.